Adult Protective Services, or APS, is a program within Community Living, Aging, and Protective Services that serves vulnerable adults age 18 and older who need assistance because of abuse, neglect, self-neglect, or financial exploitation. APS helps vulnerable adults connect to the services they need so they can stay safely in their homes and communities whenever possible. A vulnerable adult is someone who is 18 years of age or older and is incapacitated or has a substantial impairment. When assessing for substantial impairment, APS needs to know if the adult is able to provide for their own self-care or custody, manage their own property and finances, meet essential requirements for their mental or physical health or safety, or protect themselves from maltreatment without assistance. APS investigates caretaker abuse, caretaker neglect, caretaker exploitation, financial neglect, abandonment, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, and personal degradation. It also investigates non-caretaker exploitation and self-neglect. Each type of maltreatment, other than self-neglect and non-caretaker exploitation, requires that the alleged perpetrator be a caretaker of the vulnerable adult. A caretaker is an individual responsible for providing care or managing finances for a vulnerable adult. A caretaker can be a family member, friend, volunteer, or someone who is being paid to provide care for the individual. They can also be a legal guardian or conservator. Something to keep in mind is, if someone is married to or lives with a vulnerable adult, they may not necessarily be the adult's caretaker. There are multiple warning signs that a vulnerable adult may be experiencing maltreatment or abuse. These include unexplained or untreated bruises or injuries, inappropriate administration of medication, recent changes in behavior, isolation, contradictory statements, implausible stories, hesitation to talk openly, confusion or disorientation, anger, inadequate shelter, inadequate or spoiled food, multiple prescription bottles from multiple doctors or pharmacies, numerous unpaid bills, signing over deeds to property, being unaware of monthly income and/or expenses, and unusual activity in their bank account. There are also warning signs to look for in the caregiver. These include showing a lack of affection toward the vulnerable adult, believing the vulnerable adult could do more self-care than they are actually capable of doing, speaking about the vulnerable adult as being a burden to them, preventing the vulnerable adult from speaking to or seeing visitors, and refusing to spend money on the vulnerable adult. A person should report their concerns to APS as soon as they are aware that a vulnerable adult may be experiencing abuse or exploitation. Reports can be submitted online at abuseisnotok.org or by calling the Abuse and Neglect Hotline at 1-800-522-3511. Your identity will be protected if you submit a report to APS. Per Title 43A, APS cannot release the identity of the reporter unless it is ordered by the court. APS may request health and financial information from agencies and financial institutions to be able to conduct a thorough investigation. Access to these records helps APS determine if any type of maltreatment occurred and recommend necessary services to the vulnerable adult. APS cannot force a vulnerable adult to accept any services if they have capacity to consent. Capacity to consent is the person's ability to understand the situation they are in, their limitations, the consequences if the situation continues, and the resources that are available to assist them. If a person has capacity to consent, they have the right to make their own decisions. If a vulnerable adult is a danger to themselves, there are limitations to what APS can do to help them. If a person's only vulnerability is mental illness or substance abuse, they need to be assessed by a mental health professional for an emergency detention. APS does not have the legal authority to emergency detain someone. APS only works with individuals who are homeless if they are vulnerable adults and there are allegations of maltreatment. Homelessness in and of itself does not automatically meet the criteria for APS to become involved. APS also does not have the legal authority to evict someone. An eviction has to go through the legal process. APS only investigates domestic violence if the adult is a vulnerable adult and the alleged perpetrator is a caregiver for the adult. If the victim is not a vulnerable adult or the alleged perpetrator is not a caregiver, law enforcement should be contacted instead of APS. You can submit a report to APS online at abuseisnotok.org or by calling the Abuse and Neglect Hotline at 1-800-522-3511. To submit a report, you will need the following information: the vulnerable adult's name, address or location, and phone number. Information about the vulnerable adult's health problems, communication problems, and mobility problems. The alleged perpetrator's name, address, and phone number if applicable, how the alleged perpetrator assists the vulnerable adult, and a description of the vulnerable adult's situation. If you would like additional training about APS for your agency, please send a request to communityaps@okdhs.org.